I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Get In The Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Get In The Mecha, and in today's episode, we not only have a new intro, but in today's episode we are starting something very new, which is our look through the Monogatari series. If you have been listening regularly, I'm sure you know that I do really like this series. I've spoken about it kind of at length at the end of the Space and Aspect Ratios episode, alongside my kind of prelude to this all being the What is Humanity sort of episode. I didn't remember if I called it Humanity, but it was that sort of idea where we questioned that in relation to Monogatari and the Monogatari series as a whole. And today's episode is going to be a real actual dive into the series itself, as we are starting with the Hitagi Crab arc. In this episode, as I said, I wanted to discuss ideas of surrealism and how we get that from the beginning of the arc. What does this arc tell us, and how does this arc really lead us into the series? And also, what can we take from it going into the next one? And so, without further ado, here is the episode for this week. That is episode 78 of Get In The Mecha, the Hitagi Crab arc. As always on the show, I like to give you alerts before I get into the actual meat of the content, because I don't want you blaming me for spoilers, and so that will obviously be spoilers for the Hitagi Crab arc. There will obviously be a plot summary, and I will be going a bit into the plot. I'm not really going to dive so into it, but I do want to extract some things from it. So the goal for these arcs, as always, or these arc analyses, is that I don't want to use hindsight completely, or at least bring in content from other arcs and say, oh, this is why, or it proves this. I might be thinking about things on, upon rewatch, this is how I feel, or as the show progresses, this is how I feel this will go on, but it's never really going to be, okay, this happened in this arc, and I want you to know that this is how it applies here. Not really. I kind of want to keep things relative to the time of which I was watching it then, and yeah, so it doesn't just become very diluted because we are looking very specifically at this arc. The Hitagi Crab arc is not only the first arc of Bakemonogatari, but it is the first arc in the Monogatari series. Not particularly chronologically, but in the order of which it's supposed to be consumed, at least from the anime perspective and the light novel perspective. You will read this or watch this with the Hitagi Crab arc as the first one. Both episodes are storyboarded according to the Bakemonogatari wiki by Nobuyuki Takeuchi, which you may know from Sara Zanmai. They worked on some of the opening sequences as well as some of them throughout the show as well as a key animator. And then in terms of episode directors, we have Tatsuya Oishi, of course, the director of this series alongside Akiyuki Shimbo. There's Yukihiro Miyamoto, Tomoyuki Itamura, and then Shin Itagaki. Again, these are all according to the Bakemonogatari wiki. If there are obviously some, because there are slip-ups in some of these wiki, if there are any mistakes or errors, then feel free to contact. That should be in the description for the episode. So this arc isn't particularly the first chronologically, but it is the intended first arc. It is placed there by Nishio Isin for us to consume first. Although it has no obligation to do so necessarily, it trains us to get sort of submerged into the narrative and kind of what foot it starts on. That foot isn't only representative of the tone and narrative of the series, but it's also getting us used to this aesthetic, which we'll dive into a bit later. As someone who watched very little of Oishi prior to watching the Monogatari series, or maybe even anything from Shaft in general besides maybe March Comes In Like a Lion, that's the only one that really comes to the top of my head. And as a result, I was actually quite taken back by all these things which you would consider the standard in filmmaking, how these were almost completely broken, distorted and warped by Oishi and these episode directors over at Shaft. Everything from those intertitle cards and their different colors to the chapters being spliced across the scenes and all these different things which I just didn't really know were doable in anime. And I don't even know if doable is the term, but at least I didn't think anyone was daring enough to do so, and Oishi and Ko were really the people to do that for me, and that is really where I think we can start off this analysis today. The Monogatari series as a whole is a pretty different series to almost anything I've ever watched, and that is not only just in terms of narrative, but aesthetic and the way in which it communicates this very narrative. The Hitagi Crab art basically works as an intro to Shaft, really. It's a great way to just get down all these very fundamental concepts which we often, I don't want to say we look away from, but these aren't things which we see very prominently in anime filmmaking, and those on the project really opened my eyes, and I think will open anyone's eyes to someone that really haven't, or to anyone that hasn't really dived into this Shaft world before. And I think that's a good place to then go on to a plot summary to define this arc in particular, and then we can go into what makes this arc special to me. So here is a plot summary for the Hitagi Crab arc. Koyomi Araragi, a rather eccentric schoolboy, and Hitagi Senjukahara, currently a rather confrontational and sharp schoolgirl, cross paths by fate as Araragi finds her falling rapidly down a school staircase. Upon catching her, Araragi then discovers that she weighs almost nothing. Araragi, however, has the capability or knows someone who can fix this problem, and this guy is known as Oshino Meme. Oshino helped him remain somewhat human after his experiences with a vampire during his spring break. That will be something that is explained much later. Once Araragi and Senjukahara make contact with Oshino, he then manages to set up a ritual which is a means of getting rid of what is a quote-unquote heavy stone crab which exists within her. This will subsequently give back what has been taken from her, being her weight back. This weight, however, is a representation of a lot of painful memories from her past, specifically those of her family. Her getting her weight back is essentially her accepting the presence of these memories within her own head and accepting their existence. The Hitagi Crab arc is the first arc of the Monogatari series, introducing us not only to the world in which the series takes place, but it also tells us quite a lot on what it is trying to comment on, being our internal dialogues and thoughts as well as the apparitions and occult related things. So that is the arc. I hope that wasn't too complicated, as in I hope I actually explained it okay. We're plunging into ritual and vampires and weight and crab rituals and all this stuff, even though we've been watching for 2 episodes, but I'd equally say that is part of the fun of the Monogatari series, because that is a hook, but it's also something to think about a lot, because there will be a lot of time to think about it before you're given answers, and I really like just being able to think about things a lot more and being fed breadcrumbs about why things are how they are, and also how people act how they do, which is again something the Monogatari series tries to comment on. The thing about the opening arcs of the series is that they actually have a lot of pressure on them. I kind of just mean generally, opening arcs have a lot of pressure to perform. They don't only get the ball rolling for the series, but they actually manage to sometimes tell us what to expect from that very series. And I feel like Monogatari, or the series as a whole, is one of my favorite examples of that. I would also put in something like March Comes In Like a Lion, or maybe even Naruto, for example. I really like the opening arcs of such series, but I think it's a lot more than just hooking in. We often do talk about the first episode as a hook, and I agree. I don't really have anything to nuance that with, but I think we can also perceive it in other ways as well. It tells us what to expect. You can say that that is also part of this hook theory which we have going, but yeah, I would also think that it is part of controlling our expectations and how it presents itself overall, and the first 2 episodes give us an immaculate understanding of how it's going to present itself. It's not going to be as clear cut as other series are, or some other series, but it's going to make the information a lot more intriguing to digest, and we really have to focus in order to get to grips with it. And I think that is why I really like this arc to begin with, because I feel like you know whether this series is for you from the first 2 episodes, since you have to get used to how Oishi works and how Shimbo works and how these episode directors work too. First, I'm going to comment on some narrative related things, and then we'll go into cinematography and animation related things as well. What I really like about the opening arc is that it doesn't attempt too hard to explain itself. There is some explanation, we know who is who, there isn't too much of a deal to hide things particularly, but it doesn't overdo itself, it doesn't overextend itself to try and satisfy us. It is welcome to this place which we're in. Yes, there is monologue, yes, there is dialogue, but it still feels like we're watching in on them. You could also say that this is because of a lot of the rather voyeuristic shots within the first 2 episodes, particularly the Senjugahara room scene as well, where we're sort of taken aback. But overall, besides maybe the flashback, I would say we're almost falsely satisfied. It invites the viewer to pick up the pieces for themselves, to investigate and really try and break down these things again within its aesthetic, to try and really understand who Araragi is, who Senjugahara is, who Meme is, or Oshino Meme is. It kind of gives us the shovel to do the digging. That was a very weird way of explaining it, but I think that makes a bit of sense. Personally, I watched this entire series in release order, so I didn't watch it in terms of how the light novels are constructed. They're very similar anyway, it just changes the position of some of the movies within the series, and I actually really liked it in a sense. It creates this longing mental image as to what actually happened at Spring Break, and again, why some things are how they are, because remember, we are at a point in time of which this is not the beginning of Araragi or meeting Araragi. Technically, we've kind of already met him in the chronological sense, but we are meeting him for the first time in Bakemonogatari, so it allows our mind to wander a bit as opposed to getting into the ropes immediately. This arc is structured in a very straightforward fashion, or to rephrase that a bit, I would say it's kind of like the dress rehearsal for the Monogatari series, as in the very basic structure of a Monogatari arc from sort of what I get from it, and this is very watered down, so don't take this as verbatim or as gospel. We have the apparition which is acknowledged, or the problem which is acknowledged. We then attempt to deal with said apparition, and then afterwards there's some sort of compromise, or the apparition is completely extracted, or just something happens as a result of meddling with the or said apparition. Again, it does get more complex than that, and I know that was basically a reproduction of standard narrative theory, as in acknowledging a problem and then trying to solve the problem, but in the context of Monogatari, I think it's a lot more easy to follow when you see it like that. But personally, I like knowing what I'm going to get into, and this arc, as I said, is the dress rehearsal. It really gives us an insight into how we will proceed with things, and how we will proceed with things at least within the confines of Bakemonogatari. I want to highlight that there's a difference between that and predictability. I don't find the Monogatari series predictable at all. I honestly didn't really know what was going to happen for pretty much the entire series, and it's one of the least predictable things I've watched. Is that a value judgment? Not particularly. And I think the Hitagi Crab arc is really exceptional in introducing us to this formula in a very subtle way. This lack of predictability really is generated from its aesthetic, and I would be lying to you if I said that it is one which is easy to decipher and fully understand, partially because can it really be fully understood? That's another question in itself, but at least for this arc and the nature of the series, it's made a lot more challenging to predict everything which is going to happen, partially because it is a pretty simple narrative structure for this single arc, but additionally, the aesthetic complicates things. We perceive things differently based on color choices and aspect ratios and stuff like that, so it becomes quite difficult to sort of read the series, since one is more adapting to the aesthetic as opposed to really seeing right through it. I know I made that so messy, but what I'm trying to say is that the Monogatari series' aesthetic lends itself to not being so easy to see through because we're bombarded with such new ideas and so many of these so quickly. That's not really a bad thing to me, but as a result, we end up having to get used to that and kind of learning how the series communicates itself and how it expresses itself. And that makes it harder to really see through the events because of these things which are implemented. My final narrative talking point is that it really tells us what questions the series is trying to answer and also ask. I like to frame a lot of things in terms of when we look at anime, it's what debates does it bring up? What arguments does it have? I like to think of anime like that or pieces of media like that, and the Monogatari series is no exception. This arc kind of answers Senju Gaharu's sort of internal questions and debates, really being accepting who she is and accepting that these problems have happened within her own life, and finally becoming comfortable with her existence beyond these memories rather than trying to shun them and hence lending them to this metaphorical crab. Although, yes, it is an actual apparition, but I just mean the internal crab who has stolen her weight and stolen these memories and emotions finally returns to her, and I think by her having these within her, she is gaining closure and moving on from this. The Hitagi Crab arc manages to kind of dive into, I think, what is the start of analyzing the minds of these characters and going into how these people think, but also what is within them. Who are they as people beyond their physical presence and identity? Even these basic discussions that can look like just normal chit-chat between Hanekawa and Araragi within this arc, I would say is a great start for this series, as we simply don't really know who Hanekawa is, and we assume, or it's sort of assumed that we know already, and we sort of dive into that straight away without a formal sort of introduction, and as a result, it really is the start of something new to try and understand who she is and her approach to things. To everything from I know what I know to her saying don't run down the corridor. It is gaining an understanding for who she is basically. And also beyond, again, appearances as we saw with Hitagi. Hitagi, yes, is really nice looking, but there's a lot more to that and a lot more problems which we have to understand and experience for ourselves. Something that I raised in the What is Humanity episode as a general point for this series is our humanity as a whole, and just generally the human condition cannot be determined through appearance alone. And although that is something that will carry through the series, the Hitagi Crab arc takes a good stab at this at the beginning. A half-vampire, for example, simply can't be perceived through sight alone, let alone someone that holds a crab as an apparition and weighs nothing. This isn't something we can understand on first glance, and so the Monogatari series questions inwards. It doesn't question simply what is outwards and outwards only. These are very complicated books. By complicated books, I mean the characters are very complicated books that we really have to decipher bit by bit, and the apparitions are a lens into that. And then that leads us into cinematography and aesthetic, because Oishi's visual language is something which is sort of justified by the very complicated books of these characters to gain an understanding into who they are and what they represent and how we should be perceiving them, even though we're not really forced to perceive them in a specific way, but again, it's through the lens of Tatsuya Oishi, which really teaches us some things about these characters, or manages to really assimilate us into the anime. There are a few features I want to point out as we dive into this, and there are a lot of them, at least throughout the entire 2 episodes, and so I realized that we have so many arcs to get through that I can describe some of these later or talk more in detail about them as they appear throughout the series, but at least for these 2 episodes, I think it introduces us to some very significant things that should be a really good lesson or introductory lesson into Oishi. The first one, and this is kind of vague or it's a statement, but time is essentially void within this series, or within how Oishi and these other episode directors approached the narrative. This is pretty applicable to its sequencing. I guess sequencing falls under storyboarding in the production process. And this is something we generally see within postmodern media. There is a counterattack to continuity within editing and filmmaking. Stuff like music videos are a perfect example of this. And we do take this for quote-unquote granted in a way, and even though we are already within this art period, the Monogatari series takes this to another level, the one which I just simply hadn't experienced before. Some of my favorite examples of this and the very sort of surrealist, we'll get into that soon, don't worry. Some of these very surrealist-esque elements come from episode 2's ritual scene, where Senju Gahara is basically answering these questions from Oshino in order to get into the ritual, but as you'll notice throughout the scene, it's very masterful because first thing is that Hitagi's head is basically tilting to, if I'm not wrong, the right, or her left, basically. And that is, it's tilting across, but you'll notice that she's answering questions with her mouth closed and her eyes closed. And also, as her head is moving and veering to the left, that is cut in between by other scenes. But what is even cooler is that you'll notice that even though she is moving, every time it cuts back to her, she's in the same position at which she left off. And so, by that, we can prove that continuity is void, for example. In sort of typical continuity filmmaking, what would happen is that you would assume that both events are happening at the same time, unless, yes, literally someone was pausing their head movement every time, but realistically, someone would do the full motion, and based on the time of which it's happening, we would come back to them within this motion, and they might not be completely finished within tilting their head across the screen, but they would have made some progress. But as the Monogatari series does, and as it is sequenced, continuity isn't really the focus. It distorts that, it throws it out of the window because there are so many more possibilities and things you can achieve by doing this, and again, we will get to that a bit later. The ritual scene from this first arc reminds me that nothing is fixed within this way of presenting things. Everything from desaturating a lot of the colors and then emphasizing the reds upon Oshino's meeting with Senju Gahara and Araragi, to imposing a new aspect ratio for very brief periods of time when Araragi has his eyes squinting up a bit, to even switching to live action or real life photography and video, basically changing the medium of which we're in, switching between the two. And one of my favorite examples is even within the OP, having a massive Senju Gahara just walking through the not skyscrapers, but what I assume to be flat blocks as well. What I am trying to say is that this not only is very cool to watch, but it's a rebuttal to filmmaking principles which again we take for granted or we assume are the way of doing things. And that's not a very complex point. I know it's not a very big thing to say. Boo is breaking some rules, but how this translates and how this manifests itself throughout the series is something which I can't explain in simply a 5-minute segment, but it works really well basically. I think that this all fits under the umbrella of surrealism. Yes, you could say that it fits probably under like postmodernism as well, but postmodernism in itself extracts a lot from surrealism when it comes to filmmaking, so let's just call it surrealism. There's a really nice definition from Tate, or the Tate Institution, for like art and stuff. In summary, Tate basically defines surrealism as a rejection of rationality and an emphasis on the unconscious meaning within the mind. And if we were to relate this to the series, I actually really like how that looks. Mono's main concern really is the irrational, and what happens when the irrational dominates, when we have these irrational beings being apparitions. What do we do when they take control of our own lives? It is basically, yes, the domination of irrationality within one's life, and also the irrationality of feelings and emotions. We learn about that because that is how these apparitions manifest themselves. In the case of Hitagi, this crab manifested from these bad feelings and from these sad and unfortunate feelings about her family. And so if we are to view Monogatari's aesthetic as surrealist, then we are in turn accepting that irrationality is basically the forefront and focus of this series, and as a result, the two blend really well together. It is a narrative that concerns irrationality in the form of feelings which manifest into apparitions, and then we have an sort of artistic philosophy or aesthetic philosophy that concerns the rejection of rationality and embracing irrationality, basically in the unconscious. And that is really smart and really well thought out. It all really boils down to the human condition. Who are we? How do we coordinate our emotions? How do we manage our emotions? What does it mean to be emotional in itself? Through this way, and in the case of Hitagi, it's learning how to manage emotions. Hitagi stashes away these emotions and lets them run away from this crab, and I don't want to blame her. I'm not particularly blaming her for anything, but these tales of these apparitions, and again what Hitagi did basically, is simply a reflection of human behavior, but we have an actual physical thing, or at least a spiritual sort of being, or being the crab. We can actually understand it a bit more because there's an actual being representing it, but in the real world it is simply about how we manage our own emotions. There is no crab, unfortunately. And so I conclude pretty much by saying that the Monogatari series provides us with a very nuanced and irrational view into the world. It puts the irrational first. It doesn't really put it on the back burner whatsoever. And the Hitagi Crab arc is an amazing introduction to this. It introduces us to how this series will be put together visually and from the narrative point of view. So that is the analysis for this week. Thank you for listening. We actually have a segment though, so do not go anywhere actually. I would appreciate it if you stay. I'm just going to briefly talk about what I've been watching lately, at least. I can't give you a whole list of that because it's been a while since I did a segment, but I will talk about the seasonal anime, which I am watching right now. If you are new to the In The Moment segment, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are because I know we started YouTube and I haven't really been doing segments that much since I started YouTube, but if you are new, then the very basic idea of this episode, or this segment, sorry, is to just talk about what I've been watching, just for brief moments before we end the episode. And so this week I have, the new season has started, the winter season of 2021 is upon us, and so what have I been watching? I have been watching One Direct Priority, Skate, and finally 2.43. Three shows which I'm actually really impressed with, particularly One Direct Priority. I have been furiously pushing the agenda for One Direct Priority from, I don't want to say from its inception, but at least since the first episode dropped, I have been egg everywhere, and it was a great episode, honestly. Wakabayashi did a phenomenal job with this one, and we do have to see how it plays out, obviously. I'm not gonna put all my quote-unquote eggs in one basket, excuse my very bad pun, but I will obviously wait to see how it goes. It is a 12-episode series, but it's a lot darker than I thought. I won't go into spoilers for this because I didn't make anyone aware, but a lot darker than I thought. I thought this was going to be a great happy series, but I was wrong. But even so, it'd be something really fun to experience. 2.43 was pretty dark on the end, but it's still a really... I enjoyed the first episode quite a lot, maybe more than some, or even most, but I'm not very... Maybe because I'm not the... I don't dislike Haikyuu. I think Haikyuu's a great anime, but the extent to which I like Haikyuu versus other people who maybe are watching this too, is they're on different levels, and I don't often even talk about Haikyuu generally, and I think I'm not very fazed by a new volleyball anime. I'm not like, it's not gonna be as good as Haikyuu, because I don't really care to compare it to that because my relationship with Haikyuu isn't really there yet. So I will be happy to see how this goes. Maybe I'll enjoy it more than Haikyuu. I'm like in the middle of season 2, and again, I think it's good. I enjoy it, but the extent to which I like it isn't something... I don't love it to the level to which I can fully just compare 2.43 to it. I'm very open to 2.43 basically. And then we had Skate's first episode, which was really, really good to me. That might have been, it's between Wonder Egg and Skate for my favorite first episode. I really love the end of the Skate episode. It's always the endings that are so good for these episodes, but with Skates, what was so nice is that it's just really fun, and I think in a time like this, at least within a lockdown right now, I need something like Skate, something that's going to completely take me out of it. I'm not trying to say that I don't know where it's going. It's obviously an original, so there's no manga or source material to reference, but from where it seems to be going, I'm sure there will be some sadder moments, but it seems to have a general positive vibe, and I need a show like this, and it kept the positive vibe even in the most intense parts. Intense meaning skateboard races, but that being said, it was enjoyable from start to finish, and I can't wait to experience more every week if I manage to even keep up with these every single week. So that is the In The Moment segment done. I don't have too much to talk about, and I don't want this to drone on for a while because I still have to edit this. So let's go to closing thoughts, wrap up the show, and I will see you on your way for this episode. I know I did go on many weird routes when explaining the Monogatari series' first arc, the Hitagi Crab arc, or not really explaining it, but at least explaining my thoughts on it. And so I want to give a very nice and sweet summary before this episode is over. The very heart of what I'm trying to say is that in the case of the Hitagi Crab arc, I think it's an excellent arc for introducing us to how things are communicated alongside where its focuses are. It focuses a lot on the internal and thinking more about who we are and our thought processes within the intertitle cards, through the aspect ratio, through the absence of time, in a sense, through not being chronological in some cases and just denying continuity. All of that is, from the aesthetic point of view, trying to look into the unconscious. But by having a pretty straightforward arc, it gives us time to just get used to things and adjust to this new series and way of looking at the world. Thank you for listening to this episode of Get In The Mecha. That has been episode 78. I hope you did enjoy this one, and it will be, I think I'm getting used to, or I'm trying to get used to myself getting around the series, at least in terms of talking about it, because it will take time to get used to, and by the time we are through some of these arcs, it will become a bit easier to kind of talk about and discuss. But thank you for listening. If you do want to support the show, what can you do? You can subscribe on YouTube. That should also be on your screen towards the end of this episode too, so you can subscribe. You can obviously like and comment, the bell for notifications, all the YouTubery things, also listening to the other podcasts if you haven't already. If you are on Apple, then it would be really appreciated if you left a review on Apple Podcasts. That simply just lets more people see the show, and that would really help out, honestly. Every viewer would be very appreciated, and so if you left a review, that would be very nice. As usual, I don't really know what I'm going to be doing this week, but what I can say is please stay safe, and yes, that is the most important thing. But it's been fun. Thank you for spending your time here. I will see you on the next episode of the podcast. And with that being said, I have been your host Shamar today, and this has been Get In The Mecha. The music in this production goes as follows: Synthwave by Alex McCulloch, Jazz by Alex McCulloch, Mandatory Overtime by Joth, and Different by Chasersgaming.